Welcome to the For Preaching channel. Today we're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 1 verses 2 through 6. Universally, genealogies are pretty meh. People generally don't care to read through the genealogies quite as much. It's usually full of names that are a little trickier to pronounce. It's easier to kind of glaze over as we're reading through our genealogies, especially if you're a day like 250 of 365 in your Bible reading plan. But today we're going to be looking at the first 14 generations of the genealogy of Christ. Now, the beautiful thing about genealogies is that while they may be difficult, they provide us with a couple of really valuable benefits. The first being, it gives us an opportunity to see God's plan in sort of a God's eye view, a bird's eye view, if you will, of God's plan. It gives us an opportunity to see the larger picture of what God's been up to over this time period. But it also gives us other benefit because it gives us sort of this amazingly diverse cast of people, some faithful, some unfaithful, and it gives us an opportunity to see how they are both distinct but also unified in their faith. Last week we had a chance to look at David and Abraham, which bookend today's passage. We saw the standard of faith that these men present for us and how Christ really was the perfect intersection of their two templates. But not everyone in Christ's royal line met these standards. Maybe more surprising is that some of the people wouldn't even normally have been included in this genealogy at all. But let's just jump right in and see what we find. So we'll start in verse 2. We'll just go until we find the first person we want to look at. Starting in verse 2, it says, Abraham was the father of Isaac, and Isaac the father of Jacob, and Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers, and Judah the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar. So, the first person we need to look at, because we kind of stop in the middle of that verse, the first person we need to look at is this guy Judah. Now, I think we can roundly say, maybe this is even too nice, that Judah is a pretty terrible guy. Judah, at the high point of his career, suggests selling his brother into slavery rather than killing him. So you can kind of get an idea. And in our passage, you'll notice that Judah isn't mentioned by himself, but rather Judah fathers Perez and Zerah by Tamar. Now, Tamar is Judah's daughter-in-law. You can feel free to cringe now. And Tamar, though her actions in this situation are going to prove questionable, it does seem that she's mentioned here not to condemn her, but to condemn Judah. So if you aren't familiar with the story, let's take you down a rabbit trail. In Genesis 38, we see the story of Judah as he leaves, kind of separates from his brothers, which you can already tell is going to be a bad idea, and travels on into the land of Canaan. He finds a buddy of one of the people that lives out there, and he ends up shacking up, for lack of a better term, with a Canaanite woman. And he has 3 sons, Onan, and Shelah. Now, he has a wife, and his wife's name is Tamar. Is awful. He is much like his dad, terrible, and he's described in Genesis 38 as being a wicked man. So wicked, in fact, that God simply kills him. And so if you're not familiar with the Levirate law, the way it works is if a man dies and has no heirs, especially a firstborn, like then the duty of his next brother is to go into his brother's wife and provide an heir for the brother that died without one. So, as law would dictate at this time period, Onan comes and is given the duty of creating an heir for However, Onan, for various possible reasons, chooses he has no desire to do that. And so he physically manipulates the situation. I'll let you read Genesis 38 to see what it says. Physically manipulates the situation in order to prevent providing an heir for I mean, there are lots of reasons why he could do this. The biggest one being if has no heirs, then a lion's share of the inheritance and property ultimately will fall on Onan, which is better for him. But regardless of the reason, he chooses to try to circumvent this rule. Well, God, being all-knowing, has figured out his plan and kills him as well. He's not really any better than and so God treats him exactly the same way. And Judah seeing what has happened, not knowing the circumstances perfectly, just knows that every time Tamar is involved with someone, they die, is reluctant to give his third-born son to create an heir. And his reluctance is maybe justified. So he sends Tamar to go and live with her father because Shelah is not currently old enough to be able to be used in this fashion. And so the time comes when Shelah should be given to Tamar to be able to produce an heir, and Judah doesn't give him to her. Now Tamar understands what's going on. She sees what's happened, and rather than, go and fight this whole thing, she bides her time. She figures things out. Eventually Judah's wife dies, and Judah has to make a journey up to another place to where he can take care of some sheep herding problems. And Tamar hears of this, and so her plan is hatched. She goes and dresses like a prostitute with a veil that would cover her face in such a way that she would be unrecognizable, and goes to the city gate and sits outside. Judah approaches the city gate. Again, he's a terrible guy. Sees a prostitute and says, "Yes, I'll have some of that," and goes and engages Tamar. Now, when she asks what he'll give her, because prostitution, not free, he says that he'll give her a young goat, but as he is currently not in possession of a young goat, she asks, "What will you give me so that I can be sure that you'll bring me this goat?" He said, "Well, what do you want?" She said, "Well, I'd like your signet ring. I'd like your cord around your neck," which is usually holding the signet ring, "and I'd like your staff." And so he's like, "Sure, I don't need any of those three things right now." So he gives her those things, and they engage in their activity. We'll just leave it at that. Afterwards, he goes on his way. Tamar returns home, taking with her those three trinkets. Now, when Judah finishes his job and comes back, he sends a young goat to the city gate with his friend, and his friend is unable to find this prostitute. And he asks around where the cult prostitute is. Again, Judah, not a great guy. He probably knew it was a cult prostitute, or at least he thought she was. The townspeople tell Judah's friend, "There has never been a cult prostitute here." So he comes back, and Judah and him are confused. But Judah says, "You know what? We'll just drop it. We're going to become the laughing stocks. We're running around with this goat trying to find an invisible prostitute." And so they kind of leave it. But eventually, as things tend to work out, Tamar is pregnant. And at the 3-month mark, it becomes noticeable that she is pregnant. And so it's reported to Judah that Tamar is pregnant by immorality. Now, Judah, maybe the only time he's ever really tried to keep the law, says, "All right, well, let's burn her alive," because that was the penalty for committing adultery in this way, was to kill the woman. It would be also to kill the man if they knew who he was. But then, on their way to get her, on their way bringing Tamar in, knowing that the man would also be killed, Tamar is like, "Well, let me identify who it is that I have had in my affair with. These 3 articles belong to the man who has impregnated me." She brings out the staff, the cord, and the signet ring. And Judah, for who he is pretty upright and says that Tamar is more righteous than I, because she has taken care of this and received an heir the way she's supposed to, and whereas Judah has failed to give her his son. So, Judah's a terrible guy. Tamar ultimately receives the heir that she's due. But incredibly, after all of this, Judah is still included in the line of Christ. Now, if it was left up to us to fulfill God's plan would get ruined every single turn by people like Judah, right? If we look back at Abraham in Genesis 15, verse 6, we see that it was his belief in God that was counted or credited to him as righteousness. Genesis 15:6 says, "And he believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness." So this phrase, "believed on the Lord and counted to him as righteousness," this phrase is the hinge of the entire gospel. To really see kind of how this is working, we have to look at Romans chapter 4, verses 13 through 17, which says this: "For the promise to Abraham and his offspring, that he would be heir of the world, did not come through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. For if it is the adherents of the law who are to be the heirs, faith is null and the promise is void. For the law brings wrath, but where there is no law, there is no transgression." That is why it depends on faith, in order that the promise may rest on grace and be guaranteed to all his offspring, not only to the adherent of the law, but also to the one who shares the faith of Abraham, who is the father of us all. As it is written, "I have made you the father of many nations," in the presence of the God in whom he believed, who gives life to the dead and calls into existence the things that do not exist. So the main idea here is that God's promise to bless the world through Abraham, i.e., send a savior, rested on grace through faith. It did not rest on people like Judah's ability to be upright and lawful. So Judah being in the line of Christ is really a testament to the fact that the lack of quality disciples is never an inhibiting factor to God's plan. Ultimately, though, if we stop and condemn Judah, we have to condemn us too, right? Romans chapter 3, verses 10 through 12 tells us very clearly who it is that's righteous. And it says this: "As it is written, none is righteous. No, not one. No one understands. No one seeks for God. All have turned aside. Together they have become worthless. No one does good, not even one." Now, this is not a license for us to sin. Just because we are incapable of keeping God's law does not mean we should not be striving to do so out of a love for God. But more on that later. Let's continue on in this genealogy. We'll just go back to the beginning of verse 3. That way we make sure we catch everything. So in verse 3 it says, "And Judah, the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, and Perez, the father of Hezron, and Hezron, the father of Ram, and Ram, the father of Amminadab, and Amminadab, the father of Nahshon, and Nahshon, the father of Salmon, and Salmon, the father of Boaz by Rahab." Let's pause there. Now, Rahab is another one of these people that we don't expect in this particular genealogy. Now, genealogies in general at this time period wouldn't include women, but especially here, and this is a royal genealogy tracing line from Abraham to David to ultimately the Messiah, Christ. And we wouldn't expect to see a woman here partly because genealogies wouldn't have women in them, but maybe more importantly because a royal lineage would have no need to track the mothers, because the inheritance, the rights, the kingship transfers from father to son, father to son, father to son. So it's odd that Rahab is mentioned here. But it's also odd because Rahab is a citizen of Jericho at the time of her entrance into the Bible narrative, which makes her likely a Canaanite, which, as we mentioned earlier, not really a credit to her. And also, Rahab is a prostitute. Though you might be one of those people who argues that she maybe was running an inn or some of that nature, the fact that the New Testament uses the Greek word porne to describe her tells us, that word is almost exclusively translated harlot or prostitute. It tells us that at the very best case scenario, and she's running some kind of a brothel, she's still ultimately culpable, or at least complicit in the sexual misconduct that's taking place, if not actively involved in it herself. But the point of the story is not that Rahab is a prostitute. The point of the story is that Rahab has tremendous faith. Now, if we recall the story from Joshua 2, we'll see that Rahab, like many others, recognized God's hand on the Israelites. Now to back up, Joshua chapter 2 is the story of Joshua sending in the 2 spies to scope out Jericho. And this is their second pass of the promised land. The first pass of the promised land, 12 spies went in, and Joshua was one of them. This time, Joshua is sending just 2 spies in because he's the new leader of Israel at this point. And these 2 spies have gone in, and Rahab, which is the home of Rahab is where these 2 spies are staying. That's probably a topic for another sermon. They are being hid. They're in hiding because the king's men of Jericho are looking for them, obviously to kill them because they've heard that these men are coming to scope out their city. And so Rahab is choosing to hide these men and leads the king's guards off in a different way. And in doing so, she also sort of negotiates herself a deal to be spared when Israel comes in and takes down the city. But the fact that Rahab recognizes who God is and who the men are is incredible. In fact, as she's talking to the men, she tells them in Joshua 2 that the whole city, the men of the region and Jericho, they have heard what God has been doing in Israel. And they have seen the mighty acts that God has done, things like splitting the Red Sea and wiping out some of these really powerful nations where God has been with Israel and against these other people. But unlike others, while all of these people are seeing what God is doing, Rahab, like them, is seeing and recognizing that it's God who's doing them. Unlike the others, Rahab is actively trying to be on God's side. Because Rahab believes that God is who he says he is and does what he says he'll do. She is not under the impression that Israel is going to reach Jericho's borders and suddenly give up or be unable to penetrate these walls. And not only is she actively working to be on God's side, she's also actively working to bring her own family to a place of safety. Right? As she barters this deal, she asks about her family and says, can they all come into the house? She gathers them all into her house. That way when she hangs that scarlet thread in the window and their house is preserved, saved, the people in her household will be saved as well, which must happen since Salmon here, her husband in our passage for today, is still alive. But as we look at this, we see that the emphasis here, even though it is not as clear in Joshua 2, the emphasis that the Bible is making on Rahab's position is her faith. And we see this by looking at the New Testament. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 31, it says, by faith Rahab the prostitute did not perish with those who were disobedient, because she had given a friendly welcome to the spies. By faith, she did this. Now, it's an important thing to note that the standard did not change for Rahab. It didn't change for her because she was a woman. It didn't change for her because she was a Canaanite. It didn't change for her because she was a prostitute. God's standard of faith was the same for Rahab as it was for Abraham. Abraham believed and it was counted to him as righteousness. Rahab, by faith, believed and it was counted to her as righteousness. So, interestingly enough, it's Rahab's faith in all of this that saves her. But Rahab's faith is more than just a whimsical, I've heard about this God doing things and I believe he does stuff. Rahab's faith is a faith that also works itself out. Right? If we look at James chapter 2, verses 24 and 20 through 26, we'll see Rahab show up again. And it says this, you see that a person is justified by works and not by faith alone. And in the same way, was not also Rahab the prostitute justified by works when she received the messengers and sent them out by another way? For as the body apart from the spirit is dead, so also faith apart from works is dead. Now, James here is not trying to say that somehow, some way, our works are the ultimate affectation of our salvation. Rather, he is saying that a faith that truly believes in God, a faith that loves God, that believes that God is who he says he is and does what he says he'll do, will act on that belief. It will act on that knowledge. You could even maybe argue that it is salvation itself which prompts good works in our lives. Not works that prompt salvation, but rather salvation prompts works. Interestingly enough, in Rahab's case, though, Rahab is actually connected pretty directly to the next person we're going to look at. So let's pause here on this idea of faith working. And let's look at the next person and see how maybe they'll help us complete this idea. So we'll go back to verse 5. We'll read through about halfway through verse 6. And we'll look at the second half of verse 6 in next week's sermon. So starting in verse 5, it says this, and Salmon, the father of Boaz, by Rahab, and Boaz, the father of Obed, by Ruth, and Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David the king. So we've made it to David, but you'll notice there's another woman mentioned here. This time, her name is Ruth. Much like Rahab, Ruth is not an Israelite. And also like Rahab, Ruth did not grow up in Israel. In fact, Rahab's husband, who is dead when their story really begins, or shortly after it begins, they have left Israel to go to Moab in order to live and work and farm. And so Ruth here, she really has no interaction with the one true God prior to meeting and this family and effectively marrying into this family. Now, like I said, she's not a likely candidate for a genealogy, an Israeli royal genealogy leading to the Messiah, because she's a Moabitess. Moab and Israel, they're not really good friends at this point. And she's not been living in Israel, so that also kind of means it's weird that she's here. But ultimately, we see that her decision to honor Naomi ultimately shows her decision to honor God. We can see by Ruth's faith, or we can see Ruth's faith by how she treats Naomi. A good example for sort of the template that Ruth lives by is Proverbs 31. Now, I'll let you read that on your own time, but it's a very good picture of the kind of woman that Ruth is, because she cares for Naomi. She cares for those who need caring for, and she's out in the workforce taking care of things and getting the job done when it needs to be done. And even though Naomi herself is not necessarily described as being this discipler, their only way that Ruth knows about God is through this family. It's through either Naomi or her sons or her husband. And at some way, if it was Naomi who discipled Ruth, or if it was Ruth's husband raised by Naomi. So we can see how Naomi herself is helping further this faith in God by being a good discipler in sort of the background, in the shadows. And we can apply certainly James 2, 24-26, that passage about Rahab, about a faith that works and is justified. We can certainly apply that to Ruth as well. Because Ruth also believes that God is who he says he is, and does what he says he'll do. And Ruth's salvation, it's not, as we'll see, or as we have seen, and if you read through the book of Ruth, you'll see it much more clearly, Ruth's salvation is not dependent on anyone else. She was not faithful simply because Naomi forced her to be. Her faith is what made her justified. The standard of salvation is faith, and a true disciple will always have faith that compels action. So while the world constantly debates the equality of men and women, God has always had only one standard for faith. Ladies, you are being bombarded in our world by the world's plan for salvation. In order for a woman to be saved by the world's standards, she needs to shrug off her role as a mother, her role as a caregiver, and must seek out a Fortune 500 company that she can be the CEO of. And while there is nothing in the Bible that says a woman cannot or should not be a Fortune 500 company CEO, in fact, I believe there are many qualified women who are doing just that. Our main goal should not be to conform to the world, but to conform to God. No matter who we are, our standard of faith should always be to seek God's glory, or as Jesus will later put it in Matthew, spoilers, we should be seeking first the kingdom of God. So putting aside feelings and fears and those pesky, of course I do answers we give in church or when someone asks us if we're a Christian, do you have a faith that works? Is your faith based on God's ability to save, or is it based on your ability to save? The question can never be, do you have enough faith? It's a pointless question, a worthless question, because even the smallest amount of true faith is capable of saving you. Rather, we should be asking ourselves, do we have any faith at all? Because a faith that goes out and tells people that we're a Christian and then lives however we want for the rest of the week, puts no focus on God, no thought to what he wants, a faith that does not work itself out is not genuine faith. It can't save you because it's not faith. Any amount of real faith will save you. Real faith is indestructible. It will not allow you to fall away or to be given up. But the best news about this faith is that it is not your job to go get it. It is not your job to sit down and build it, to make it, to slap it together, but rather it is a gift provided to us by God. And we know this from Ephesians. If we look at Ephesians 2, 8, and 9, it says, "For by grace you have been saved through faith. And this," talking about faith, "is not your own doing. It is the gift of God, not a result of works, so that no one may boast." Faith is not of ourselves. It's a gift from God. Now, if you want to find out more, you need to go to church. This is not church. In the description below, I'll have a link to the church directory that I've recommended previously. Find a church where you can get discipled and where you can live around people who know what real faith looks like. The only way to grow in your walk is to be around others who are walking better than you are. Now, there is going to be tons of opportunities. You're going to be just bombarded. You're going to be hit with tons of social media that tell you about how all of this stuff, how churches are all filled with sinners and hypocrites. And I've got news for you. Every single church, without exception, is filled with sinners and hypocrites. Every single one of them is filled with people that want to do things their way. Every single one of them is filled with people that don't love right. The difference between the people in your neighborhood and the people in church is that only one of those groups of people is working towards becoming more like Christ. Church is what God has given us to be about, working towards Christ. It serves as the platform for which we go into the world and proclaim the gospel, the good news that faith, simple faith, is all that's required of you. But that's all I've got for this week. So until next time, I'm Sam. This is for His glory, for preaching.